From ancient scrolls to modern classics, welcome to Whispers of Japanese Tales.
In the Forest, Under Cherries in Full Bloom by Ango Sakaguchi. When the cherry blossoms bloom, people hang bottles of sake, eat dumplings, walk under the flowers, and cheerfully exclaim things like "what a stunning view," or "spring in full bloom." But this is a lie. Why is it a lie, you ask? Because when people gather under the cherry blossoms, they get drunk, vomit, and quarrel. This has been the case since the Edo period. In ancient times, people thought the area beneath the cherry blossoms was frightening, and no one considered it a breathtaking sight. These days, when we think of cherry blossoms, we imagine people gathering, drinking sake, and quarreling, leading us to believe it's a cheerful and lively scene. However, if you remove people from under the cherry blossoms, the view becomes terrifying. In No Theater, there is even a story about a mother whose beloved child was kidnapped by human traffickers. In her madness while searching for her child, she wanders beneath a grove of cherry blossoms in full bloom. She envisions the child's shadow among the petals, succumbs to madness, dies, and becomes buried beneath the falling blossoms. This last detail is my own embellishment. Without the presence of people, the sight beneath a cherry blossom grove is nothing but eerie. In the past, travelers passing through Suzuka Pass had to traverse paths that led beneath cherry blossom groves. It was fine when the trees were not in bloom, but during the blooming season, every traveler became unsettled under the blossoms. They would feel an overwhelming urge to escape as quickly as possible, dashing headlong toward the areas with green trees or barren ones, far from the blossoms. It was still manageable if you were alone. This is because, after fleeing at full speed from under the blossoms and reaching the ordinary trees, you could feel relieved and think, "Phew, it's over." However, traveling in pairs was problematic. The reason is that each person has a different running speed, so one would inevitably fall behind. Even if they desperately shouted, "Wait for me," from behind, everyone was so frantic that they abandoned their companions and kept running. As a result, once travelers passed through the cherry blossom grove of Suzuka Pass, friendships that had been strong until then would sour, and they would lose trust in each other's loyalty. Because of this, travelers naturally began avoiding passing under the cherry blossom groves, choosing instead to take the trouble of walking along detour mountain paths. Eventually, the cherry blossom groves were left behind, removed from the main road, abandoned to the quiet solitude of the mountains, where not a single soul passed through. Some years later, a lone bandit came to live in this mountain. This bandit was an exceptionally cruel man who mercilessly robbed travelers of their clothing and even took lives on the main road. Yet, even such a man would feel unsettled and frightened when he found himself beneath the cherry blossoms. The experience disturbed his mind. From that point on, the bandit developed a hatred for flowers, thinking to himself, "Flowers are terrifying, something dreadful and unpleasant." Such were the thoughts he murmured in his heart. Under the blossoms, it felt as though the wind was howling, despite there being no wind at all, and not a single sound could be heard. Only his own figure and footsteps were present, enveloped in a still, cold, and unmoving wind. As the petals softly fell, it felt as though his very soul was scattering, as if life itself were gradually fading away. This made him want to close his eyes, scream, and flee, but since closing his eyes would cause him to run into the cherry trees, he couldn't do so, which only drove him further into madness. However, the bandit was a composed man, one who knew no regret, and so he thought to himself, "This is strange." He resolved, "Next year, I'll think about it." He didn't feel like pondering it this year. Instead, he decided that when the flowers bloomed again next year, he would take his time to consider it then. He thought this way every year, and before he knew it, more than 10 years had passed. Once again, this year he told himself, "I'll think about it next year," and yet another year came to an end. While he kept putting it off, what had started with one wife grew to 7, and now he had taken an 8th wife, abducting her along with her husband's clothing from the main road. He had killed the woman's husband. However, the bandit began to feel something was off as he killed the woman's husband. It wasn't the same as usual. Something was different this time. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what felt strange, but there was something odd about it. Still, as he wasn't one to dwell on things, he didn't pay much attention to it even then. Initially, the bandit hadn't intended to kill the man. His plan was to strip him of everything, as he usually did, and then kick him away, telling him to get lost. However, the woman was too beautiful, and in a moment of impulse, he ended up cutting the man down. It was an unexpected event not only for him but also for the woman, as evidenced by her reaction. When the bandit turned around, the woman had collapsed to the ground, staring at his face blankly. When he said, "From today, you're my wife," the woman nodded. As he took her hand and tried to help her up, she said, "I can't walk. Carry me on your back." The bandit cheerfully agreed, saying, "Sure, and effortlessly carried the woman on his back. However, when they reached a steep incline, he said, "This part is dangerous, so I'd like you to get down and walk." But the woman clung tightly to him and refused, saying, "No, no, I won't. How do you expect me to walk up a path so steep that even a mountain man like you struggles? Think about it." I see. Fair enough," the man replied, still in high spirits despite his exhaustion and struggle. "But just once, please get down. It's not because I'm weak or need to rest, I'm strong, after all. The thing is, I don't have eyes on the back of my head, so carrying you this whole time has been frustrating in a way I can't explain. Just once, I'd like you to get down so I can have the pleasure of seeing your lovely face." "No, no," the woman cried again, clinging tightly to his neck. "I can't stay in such a desolate place, not even for a moment. Hurry and take me to your home without stopping for a second. If you don't, I won't be your wife. If you leave me to feel this lonely, I'll bite my tongue and end my life." All right, I understand. I'll do whatever you ask," the bandit replied. As he carried his beautiful new wife, the bandit began to imagine the joys of their future together, feeling a melting happiness that filled him completely. The bandit puffed out his chest, standing proudly as he spun around, showing her the mountains in every direction, front, back, right, and left. "All these mountains you see, they're all mine," he declared. But the woman paid no attention to his boasting, which left him both surprised and disappointed. "Listen," he continued, "every mountain you see, every tree, every valley, even the clouds rising from those valleys, they all belong to me." "Just hurry up," the woman said. "I don't want to stay at the foot of this rocky, jagged cliff." All right. When we get home, I'll prepare a feast like you've never had before." "Can't you move faster? Run," she demanded. "This path is treacherous," he explained. "Even on my own, it's hard to run through here." "You're not as capable as you look, are you?" she retorted. "To think I've ended up as the wife of such a pathetic man. Oh, what will I rely on to live from now on?" "What nonsense. A slope like this is nothing," he retorted. "Oh, how frustrating. Are you already tired?" the woman teased. "Don't be ridiculous. Once I get past this slope, I'll show you how I can outrun even a deer." "But your breathing sounds labored, and your face looks pale," she pointed out. "That's just how it is at the start of things. Once I build up momentum, I'll run so fast you'll feel dizzy on my back," he replied. But in truth, the bandit was utterly exhausted, his body feeling as though it were falling apart at the joints. By the time he finally staggered to his home, his vision was blurred, his ears were ringing, and he had no strength left to squeeze even a word from his hoarse throat. From the house, his 7 wives came out to greet him, but all he could manage was to loosen his stiff, stone-like body enough to lower the woman from his back. That alone took every ounce of his remaining strength. The 7 wives were struck by the beauty of the new woman, a kind of beauty they had never seen before. In contrast, the woman was horrified by the filthiness of the 7 wives. Among them, some had once been quite beautiful, but now they were unrecognizable shadows of their former selves. Feeling uneasy, the woman retreated behind the man's back and asked, "Who are these mountain hags?" "They're my former wives," the man replied, clearly flustered. His quick addition of former to his response was a clever touch under pressure, but the woman was not willing to let it slide. "Well, is this your wife?" the woman asked incredulously. "Well, you see," the man stammered, "I didn't know I'd ever have such a lovely wife as you." "Kill that woman," the woman suddenly screamed, pointing at the one whose face was the most refined among the 7. "But you don't have to kill her. You could just think of her as a servant," the man replied, trying to defuse the situation. "You killed my husband, didn't you? And yet you can't kill your own wife? Do you still intend to make me your wife after this?" the woman retorted mercilessly. A groan escaped from the man's tightly shut mouth. With a sudden leap, he sprang forward and cut down the woman who had been pointed out, but he had no time to catch his breath. "This one. Now, this woman," the beautiful woman commanded, pointing to the next. The man hesitated for a moment, but then he marched forward resolutely, plunging his blade into the neck of the next woman. Even before her rolling head had come to a stop, the woman's soft, glossy, and translucent voice rang out beautifully, pointing to the next target. "This one. Now it's her," she said. The woman who was pointed at covered her face with both hands and let out a piercing scream. In response to that scream, the blade flashed through the air and struck her down. The remaining women suddenly rose all at once and scattered in different directions. "Don't let even one escape," the beautiful woman commanded. "There's one hiding in the bushes. Another one is running uphill." The man, brandishing his blood-stained sword, charged madly through the forested mountains. One woman, left behind and unable to move, had collapsed to the ground in terror. The woman left behind was the ugliest of them all, with a limp. When the man returned after cutting down every last one of the fleeing women, he raised his blade casually to strike her down as well. "Leave this one," the beautiful woman said. "I'll use her as a servant." "I might as well finish her off too," the man replied. "Fool, I'm telling you not to kill her," she retorted. "Oh, I see. You're right," the man said, dropping his blood-stained sword. He collapsed onto the ground, sitting down heavily. Exhaustion suddenly surged through him, his vision blurred, and he felt the full weight of his body pressing into the ground like roots sinking into the soil. He became aware of the stillness around him. A sudden, overwhelming fear seized him, and with a start, he turned around. The woman stood there, exuding an air of quiet melancholy. The man felt as if he had awakened from a nightmare. His eyes and very soul were drawn irresistibly to her beauty, leaving him unable to move. Yet, despite this, an uneasy feeling crept over him. He couldn't quite grasp what kind of unease it was, why he felt uneasy, or what exactly was causing it. The woman's overwhelming beauty had captivated his soul so completely that he managed to push aside the ripples of anxiety in his chest. "This feels familiar somehow," he thought. "Something like this happened before. But when?" He pondered for a moment. "Ah, yes, that's it," he realized, startled. It was under the full bloom of the cherry blossom grove. The feeling was exactly like the one he experienced when passing beneath those blossoms. He couldn't pinpoint where, what, or in what way it was similar, but he was certain that something about it resembled that feeling. However, he was the kind of man who rarely bothered with things he couldn't understand, and he left it at that. The long mountain winter came to an end, though patches of snow still lingered in the shadows of trees, on the mountaintops, and in the hollows of the valleys. The signs of spring began to appear, and the sky shone with the promise of the coming season. When the cherry blossoms bloom this year, he thought. At first, when he approached the blossoms, it wasn't so overwhelming. Emboldened, he stepped under the cherry trees. As he walked further, his mind began to falter. Everywhere he looked, front, back, right, left, he saw nothing but blossoms looming above him. As he neared the heart of the grove, an unbearable, irrational terror consumed him. "This year," he thought, "I'll try something different. I'll go to the center of that blooming grove, stay completely still, or better yet, sit right down on the ground." At that moment, he wondered briefly, should I take this woman with me? Glancing at her face, a sudden unease welled up in his chest, and he hurriedly averted his gaze. For some reason, the thought that she might discern his intentions filled him with an intense, lingering sense of dread. The woman was extremely selfish. No matter how heartfelt the feasts he prepared for her, she always found something to complain about. He ran through the mountains to catch birds and deer. He even hunted wild boars and bears. The lame woman wandered the forest all day, searching for tree buds and roots. Yet, she never showed any sign of satisfaction. "Do you expect me to eat this kind of food every day? But this is the finest feast. Before you came here, I only ate food like this about once every 10 days, he replied. "You're a mountain man, so I suppose that's fine for you. But I can't swallow it. In this lonely mountain recess, the only sounds I hear on these long nights are the cries of owls. Couldn't I at least have food as delicious as what you'd find in the capital? You can't even begin to imagine what it feels like for me, cut off from the breezes of the capital. The pain of having that wind blocked from me is something you will never understand. You've torn away the breezes of the capital from me, and in return, all you've given me are the cries of crows and owls. You don't even feel ashamed or cruel about it, do you?" The man's mind could not grasp the reasoning behind the woman's complaints. This was because he did not know what the breezes of the capital were like. He couldn't even imagine them. In his life, in his happiness, there was nothing he felt was missing. He was simply bewildered by the earnest sorrow in the woman's grievances, unable to comprehend how to handle it, as he had no concrete knowledge of what she was referring to. This ignorance frustrated him. He had killed countless travelers from the capital before. Travelers from the capital were wealthy and carried luxurious belongings, making the capital an easy target for him. Yet, even after robbing their possessions, he sometimes found the contents disappointing and would curse them, calling them bumpkins or peasants. In short, his entire knowledge of the capital was limited to the fact that it was a place where people with luxurious possessions lived, and he thought of it only as a source to plunder. He had never even needed to think about which direction the sky of the capital lay. The woman treasured items like combs, hairpins, ornamental hairpieces, and rouge. If his muddy hands or hands stained with the blood of mountain beasts so much as grazed her kimono, she would scold him. It was as if her kimono was her very life, and as if protecting it was her duty. She insisted on keeping everything around her clean and ordered him to maintain the house properly. The kimono was not complete with just a single kosode and a simple sash. It required several layers of clothing, numerous sashes, and those sashes were tied in peculiar shapes, with unnecessary lengths trailing and adorned with various ornaments. Only through these additions was a single appearance fully realized. The man opened his eyes wide in astonishment and let out a sigh of admiration. He was convinced. Thus, a form of beauty was created, and he was undeniably captivated by that beauty. Fragments that were individually incomplete and incomprehensible came together to form a single, complete object. If that object were broken down, it would return to meaningless fragments. Yet, he accepted this as a kind of wondrous magic, in a way that was uniquely his own. The man began cutting trees from the mountain to craft whatever the woman commanded. What he was making and for what purpose, he couldn't understand it himself as he worked on it. It turned out to be a folding stool and an armrest. The folding stool was essentially a chair. On sunny days, the woman had him take it outside, where she would sit on it, either in the sunlight or under the shade of trees, and close her eyes. Indoors, she would lean against the armrest, lost in thought. To the man watching her, everything about her appearance seemed strange, alluring, and deeply troubling. The magic was being performed in reality, and while he himself was an assistant to this magic, he was constantly puzzled by and in awe of the results it produced. Every morning, the lame woman combed her long black hair. For this, the man would fetch water from a particularly distant and pure spring in the valley. He cherished the effort he put into this special task. His wish had become to be a part of that magic, to be one of the forces that made it happen. And he found himself wishing he could run his own hands through her combed black hair. "No, not with those hands," the woman said, brushing him away and scolding him. Like a child, he withdrew his hands in embarrassment, watching as her glossy black hair was styled, tied, and revealed her face. He saw a beauty taking shape, as if witnessing an endless dream being brought to life. "So, this is what it's all about, huh?" He fiddled with the patterned combs and ornamental hairpins. These were things he had never before recognized as having meaning or value. Even now, he did not critique the harmony or relationship between the objects or the idea of adornment, but he understood their magical power. That magic was the life within the objects. Even objects held a kind of life. You shouldn't touch those. Why do you try to handle them every single day? "It's just fascinating," he said. "What's so fascinating about it?" "Well, I can't really say," he replied, embarrassed. He felt a sense of wonder, though he could not identify its object. At the same time, a fear of the capital began to grow within him. This fear was not terror but a mix of shame and anxiety stemming from his ignorance. It was similar to the unease and embarrassment that a knowledgeable person feels when confronted with the unknown. Whenever the woman mentioned the capital, his heart trembled with fear and dread. Yet, he had never feared anything tangible before. So he was unfamiliar with the feeling of fear and equally unaccustomed to the sensation of shame. And so, he harbored only hostility toward the capital. "I've attacked hundreds, even thousands, of travelers from the capital, and not one has been a match for me," he thought with satisfaction. No matter what past events he recalled, there was no memory of betrayal or injury to cause him unease. Realizing this, he always felt a sense of pleasure and pride. He contrasted his own strength with the woman's beauty. In his awareness of his strength, the only thing he regarded as even slightly challenging was the wild boar. Even the wild boar, in reality, was not much of a formidable foe to him, so he felt at ease. "Are there people with tusks in the capital?" he asked. "There are samurai with bows," the woman replied. "Ha! Ha! Even with a bow, I can take down a sparrow on the far side of the valley. There aren't people in the capital with skins so tough it would break a sword, are there? There are samurai wearing armor. Does armor break swords?" "It does." "Well, I can wrestle down bears and boars with my bare hands," he boasted. "If you're truly a strong man, take me to the capital. Use your strength to surround me with the things I desire, the refined elegance of the capital. And if you can truly bring me joy from the depths of my heart, then you'll prove yourself a truly strong man." "That's no big deal," he replied. The man resolved to go to the capital. He intended to gather every comb, hairpin, ornamental piece, kimono, mirror, and rouge in the capital and pile them around the woman within 3 days and nights. He had no doubts or concerns. There was only one thing on his mind, entirely unrelated to the capital. It was the cherry blossom forest. In 2 or 3 days, the forest was expected to reach full bloom. This year, he had made a firm decision. He would sit motionless, completely still, in the heart of the cherry blossoms at their peak. Every day, he secretly visited the cherry blossom forest to measure the swelling of the buds. 3 more days, he said to the woman, who was urging him to hurry their departure. "You don't have anything to prepare, do you?" The woman said, furrowing her brows. "Don't keep me waiting. The capital is calling me." "Even so, I have a promise to keep," he replied. "A promise? Who in this remote mountain would you have made a promise with?" "Well, it's not with anyone, but, still, it's a promise," he said. "How strange. There's no one here, so who could you possibly have made a promise with?" The man could no longer lie. "The cherry blossoms are about to bloom," he confessed. "Did you make a promise with the cherry blossoms?" "The cherry blossoms will bloom, so I have to see them before we leave," he said. "And why is that?" "Because I have to go under the cherry blossom forest," he replied. "Why do you have to go under the forest?" "Because the flowers will bloom," he said. "And why does that matter?" "Because beneath the blossoms, a cold wind stretches taut," he answered. "Beneath the blossoms?" "Because beneath the blossoms, there is no end," he said. "Beneath the blossoms, you say?" The man became confused and frustrated, his thoughts tangled. "Take me under the blossoms too," she said. "That's not possible," he replied firmly. "It has to be just me, alone." The woman gave a wry smile. It was the first time the man had ever seen such a smile. He had never known such a spiteful kind of laughter before. Yet, he did not interpret it as spiteful. Instead, he judged it to be something that could not be cut, no matter how sharp his sword. The proof of this was that her wry smile became imprinted on his mind, as if stamped there. Every time he recalled it, it pricked his thoughts like the edge of a blade. And yet, he could not cut it away. The third day arrived. He set out in secret. The cherry blossom forest was in full bloom. As he took his first step into the forest, he remembered the woman's wry smile. With an unfamiliar sharpness, it slashed through his thoughts. That alone was enough to throw him into confusion. The coldness beneath the blossoms surged in from all directions, boundless and overwhelming. His body was suddenly exposed to the wind, becoming transparent. The wind roared through him, and soon, only the wind remained, stretched taut in every direction. Only his voice cried out. He ran. What an immense void it was! He wept, prayed, and struggled, desperate to escape. When he realized he had emerged from beneath the blossoms, he felt the same sensation as waking from a dream. The difference from a dream, however, was the genuine agony of his body, gasping for breath and utterly exhausted. The man, the woman, and the lame woman began living in the capital. Each night, the man would sneak into the mansions the woman directed him to. He brought back kimonos, jewelry, and ornaments, but those alone did not satisfy the woman's desires. What she wanted most of all were the heads of the people who lived in those mansions. Their home had already become a collection site for the heads from dozens of estates. The heads were arranged along the partitions that divided the room, some placed in rows and others hung. There were so many heads that the man could no longer tell which was which, but the woman remembered each one. Even after the hair fell out, the flesh rotted away, and only bare skulls remained, she could still recall whose family or whose household each head belonged to. If the man or the lame woman moved any of the heads, she would grow angry and scold them, saying, "This is from such and such family, that belongs to so-and-so's household." Every day, the woman played with the heads. She imagined they were her retainers and took them on walks. One family of heads would visit another family of heads. The heads would fall in love. A woman's head might reject a man's head, or a man's head might abandon a woman's head, leaving her to weep. A princess's head was deceived by the head of a dainagon, a high-ranking court noble. On a moonless night, the dainagon's head pretended to be the head of the man the princess's head loved and snuck over to her, forming a bond of love. After their union, the princess's head realized the truth. Yet, she could not bring herself to hate the dainagon's head. Instead, she cried over the sorrow of her fate and chose to become a nun. Then, the dainagon's head went to the nunnery and violated the head of the princess, who had become a nun. The princess's head tried to die, but she succumbed to the dainagon's whispers and fled the nunnery. She hid in the village of Yamashina, becoming the dainagon's concubine and letting her hair grow once more. By this time, both the princess's head and the dainagon's head had already lost their hair, their flesh had rotted, maggots crawled over them, and their bones were visible. The two heads drank together and toyed with love, their bony teeth clacking as they bit against each other, making a kachi-kachi sound. The rotting flesh squelched as it stuck together with a pecha-pecha noise, their noses collapsed, and their eyeballs had been hollowed out. As their faces distorted and fell apart each time they pressed together, the woman was overjoyed, bursting into shrill laughter and shrieking with delight. "Look! Eat the cheeks! Oh, how delicious! Let's eat the princess's throat too. Yes, bite into the eyeballs. Suck them, go ahead. Yes, lick them up. Oh, it's so delicious, isn't it? I just can't stand it anymore. Come on, go ahead, take a big bite." The woman laughed with a kara sound. It was a clear, beautiful, and pure laugh, like the crisp ringing of delicate porcelain. There was also the head of a monk. The monk's head was despised by the woman. It was always assigned villainous roles, hated, and repeatedly tormented. Sometimes it was tortured to death, and other times executed by officials. The monk's head, after being severed, began to grow hair again. Eventually, the hair fell out. It rotted away, and it turned into a bare skull. Once it became a skeleton, the woman ordered a new monk's head to be brought. The new monk's head still retained the youthful, fresh beauty of a young Shigo, temple acolyte. The woman was delighted, placing it on a desk, letting it drink sake, rubbing her cheek against it, licking it, and tickling it. However, she quickly grew bored. "I want a fatter, more hateful head," she commanded. The man, growing weary of the task, brought back 5 heads at once. Among them was the head of a frail old monk, a head with thick eyebrows, chubby cheeks, and a nose shaped like a frog clinging to his face. There was also the head of a monk with pointed, horse-like ears, and the head of an unusually solemn-looking monk. However, the woman only took a liking to one. It was the head of an older monk, around 50 years old, an ugly face with drooping eyes, sagging cheeks, and thick lips that hung open under their own weight, giving the head a sloppy appearance. The woman pressed her fingertips against the drooping corners of the eyes, twisting them upward in circles. She inserted 2 sticks into the lion-like nostrils, flipped the head upside down, rolled it around, and hugged it tightly, forcing her breast between its thick lips to suckle. She laughed uproariously. But she soon grew bored of it. There was also the head of a beautiful young woman, a pure, serene, and noble head. The head had a childlike quality, yet its lifeless expression gave it a strangely mature sorrow. It was as if joyful thoughts, sad thoughts, and precocious thoughts were all tangled together and hidden behind its closed eyelids. The woman doted on this head as if it were her own daughter or sister. She combed its black hair and applied makeup to its face. With meticulous care, adjusting this and that, she brought forth a gentle face that seemed to exude the delicate fragrance of flowers. For the young woman's head, a young nobleman's head was required. The nobleman's head was carefully made up as well, and the 2 youthful heads indulged in a tempestuous game of love. They sulked, grew angry, harbored hatred, lied, deceived, and wore expressions of sorrow to manipulate one another. Yet, when their passions flared simultaneously, the fire of one consumed the other, and both were engulfed, their flames intertwined, merging into a single inferno that soared and burned together. But before long, wicked samurai, lecherous elders, depraved monks, and other foul heads interfered. The nobleman's head was kicked, beaten, and eventually killed. From the right, the left, the front, and the back, the filthy heads swarmed over the young woman's head. Rotten flesh from the foul heads clung to the young woman's head. It was bitten by fang-like teeth, its nose chipped, and its hair was torn out in clumps. Then, the woman pierced the young woman's head with needles, poked holes into it, slashed and gouged it with a small knife, turning it into the filthiest and most hideous head of all, so repulsive it was unbearable to look at. Finally, she cast it aside. The man came to despise the capital. Once he had grown accustomed to its novelties, all that remained was a lingering sense of alienation. Even in the capital, he wore a Suican, traditional attire, like everyone else, exposing his shins as he walked. During the day, he wasn't even allowed to carry a sword. He had to go to the market to shop, and even when he drank at a tavern where white-haired patrons gathered, he had to pay for his sake. The city merchants mocked him. Even the rural women who came to sell their vegetables, and their children, ridiculed him. The white-haired patrons at the tavern also laughed at him. In the capital, nobles rode ox-drawn carriages down the center of the roads. Their barefoot retainers, dressed in Suican, often strutted around with flushed faces from free-flowing sake, swaggering and acting arrogantly. He was shouted at, called a fool, an idiot, and a slowpoke, whether in the market, on the streets, or in the temple gardens. By then, he no longer got angry about such things. What tormented him more than anything was boredom. He thought deeply, humans are such tedious creatures. In essence, what bothered him was people themselves. When a large dog walks by, small dogs bark at it. The man felt like that large dog being barked at. He disliked sulking, feeling envious, pouting, or overthinking things. The beasts, trees, rivers, and birds of the mountains weren't noisy, he thought. The capital is such a dull place, he said to the lame woman. Don't you ever wish to return to the mountains? I don't find the capital dull, she replied. The lame woman spent her days cooking, washing, and chatting with the neighbors. In the capital, I can talk with people, so I'm never bored. I hated the mountains. They were dull, she said. I hated the mountains because they were boring, she said. Don't you find talking boring? He asked. Of course not. No one feels bored while they're talking, she replied. The more I talk, the more bored I get, he said. That's because you don't talk. That's why you're bored, she said. That's not true. I don't talk because talking makes me bored, he retorted. Just try talking. You'll surely forget about being bored, she urged. About what? He asked. Anything you feel like talking about, she replied. I don't have anything I feel like talking about, he said. Frustrated, the man yawned irritably. Even in the capital, there were mountains. However, atop those mountains were temples and hermitages, and they were bustling with people coming and going. From the mountain, the entire capital could be seen at a glance. What an endless sea of houses, he thought, and what a filthy sight. During the day, he almost forgot that he killed people every night. This was because he had grown bored of killing as well. Nothing interested him anymore. When he struck with his sword, the head would simply drop off with a plop. Heads were soft things. He felt no resistance from the bones. It was no different from chopping a daikon radish. What surprised him far more was the weight of the heads. He felt as though he could begin to understand the woman's feelings. At the bell tower, a monk was striking the bell in a reckless frenzy. What a foolish thing to do, he thought. Who knows what they'll do next? If I had to live face to face with people like this, even I might choose to take their heads and live with them instead, he thought. However, he had also grown bored with the woman's insatiable desires. Her desires were like a bird flying endlessly in a straight line through the sky. Without rest, the bird continued to fly in a constant, unwavering direction. It never tired. Always slicing through the wind with exhilarating ease, it glided smoothly and endlessly, as if propelled by boundless energy. However, he was just an ordinary bird. At best, he flitted from branch to branch or occasionally crossed a valley. He resembled an owl perched on a branch, dozing. He was agile. His entire body moved with precision. His steps were quick, and his actions were lively. Yet, in his heart, he was a heavy-bottomed bird. He could never conceive of flying endlessly in a straight line. The man stood atop the mountain, gazing at the sky over the capital. In that sky, a single bird flew steadily, cutting a straight path. The sky shifted from day to night, and from night back to day, endlessly repeating cycles of light and darkness. There was nothing beyond the horizon, just the infinite repetition of light and shadow, stretching on forever. The man could not reconcile himself to the reality of infinity. He thought about the day after tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, an unending cycle of light and dark. His head felt as though it would split open, not from the exhaustion of thinking, but from the torment of grappling with such thoughts. When he returned home, the woman was, as always, absorbed in her games with the heads. When the woman saw him, she was waiting eagerly. Tonight, bring me the head of a shirabayoshi, an exceptionally beautiful one. I'll make it dance. I'll sing imayo songs to accompany it, she said. The man tried to recall the endless cycles of light and darkness he had gazed at from the mountaintop. This room should have been that same boundless sky of infinite light and shadow repeating forever. But now, he could no longer remember it. And yet, the woman was not a bird after all. She was still the same beautiful woman as always. Even so, he replied, I don't want to do it. The woman was startled. Then, she began to laugh. Oh my, have you grown cowardly? You're just a weakling now, she said. I'm not that kind of weakling, he replied. Then what is it? She asked. I'm tired of it because it's endless, he said. Oh, how funny. Everything is endless, isn't it? You eat rice every single day. That's endless, isn't it? You sleep every single day. That's endless too, isn't it? It's not the same, he said. In what way is it different? She asked. The man couldn't find an answer. Yet, he felt it was different. Unable to endure the frustration of being talked down, he fled outside. Bring me the head of the shirabayoshi, the woman's voice called after him. But he did not reply. As he walked, he pondered why it was different and how it was different, but he couldn't find the answer. Night gradually fell. Once again, he climbed to the top of the mountain. The sky was no longer visible. Before he realized it, he was thinking about the sky falling. The sky was falling. He felt as though his neck were being strangled, suffocating him. That sensation was tied to the thought of killing the woman. The endless cycle of light and darkness running through the sky could be stopped by killing the woman, and then, the sky would fall. He would feel relieved. But in his heart, there was a gaping hole. From his chest, the image of a bird flew away and vanished. Was that woman me? And was the bird flying endlessly in a straight line through the sky also me? He wondered. If I kill the woman, Will I be killing myself? What am I even thinking? He no longer understood why he felt the need to bring the sky down. All his thoughts had become elusive, slipping away before he could grasp them. And what remained after those fleeting thoughts was only pain. Dawn broke. He had lost the courage to return to the woman's house, and for several days, he wandered through the mountains. One morning, when he woke up, he found himself lying beneath a cherry tree. It was a single tree, and it was in full bloom. He was startled and jumped to his feet, but it was not out of the need to flee. It was because there was only one cherry tree. Suddenly, he remembered the cherry blossom forest on Mount Suzuka. Surely, the forest there was also in full bloom. He was overcome with nostalgia and sank into deep thought. I should return to the mountains. I'm going back to the mountains. Why had I forgotten this simple truth? And why had I been consumed by thoughts of bringing the sky down? It felt like waking from a nightmare. He felt as though he had been saved. The scent of early spring in the mountains, a scent he had lost touch with until now, reached him, and he could feel it keenly, both cold and strong. The man returned home. The woman greeted him with a happy expression. Where have you been? I'm sorry for making you suffer with unreasonable requests, but please understand the loneliness I've felt since you've been gone. It was the first time the woman had been so gentle, and the man's chest ached. His resolve was almost on the verge of melting away, slipping from him, but he steeled himself. I've decided to return to the mountains, he said. Leave me behind? How could such a cruel thought have taken root in your heart? The woman's eyes blazed with anger. Her face was filled with the bitterness of betrayal. When did you become so heartless? That's just it. I hate the capital, he replied. Even with me here? I just don't want to live in the capital anymore. But I'm here, aren't I? Have you started to hate me? While you've been gone, I've only thought about you. Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. It was the first time tears had appeared in the woman's eyes. The anger had disappeared from her face, leaving only a deep sadness, full of yearning and regret. Because you can't live anywhere but the capital, right? But I can't live anywhere but the mountains, he said. I can't live without you. Don't you understand how I feel? She replied, her voice thick with emotion. But I can't live anywhere but the mountains, he said again, his resolve unwavering. So, if you're going back to the mountains, I'll go with you. I can't live a single day without you, she said. Her eyes were wet with tears. She pressed her face against his chest, letting the hot tears flow. The warmth of her tears soaked into his chest. It was clear, she could no longer live without him. The new head was her life, and the one who could bring that head to her was no one but him. He was a part of her. The woman could not let go of him. She was certain that once his nostalgia was fulfilled, she would be able to bring him back to the capital once more. But can you really live in the mountains? She asked. If I'm with you, I can live anywhere, he replied. In the mountains, there's no head you would desire, she said. If I have to choose between you and the head, I would give up the head, he said. The man doubted if it was all a dream. It was too overwhelming, too joyful for him to believe. Even in his wildest dreams, he had never imagined something like this. His heart was filled with new hope. Its arrival was abrupt and violent, and the painful thoughts he had just moments ago seemed distant and unreachable. He had even forgotten the woman from yesterday, who had not been this gentle. Now, only the present and the future existed. The two of them immediately set off. They decided to leave the lame woman behind. As they were about to depart, the woman secretly told the lame woman, "Wait for me, I will return soon." Before them appeared the familiar silhouette of the old mountains, as if they were answering a call. They decided to take the old path. The path had long since been abandoned by travelers, and it had disappeared into mere forest and mountain slopes. As they walked along it, they found themselves passing beneath the cherry blossom forest. "Carry me," she said. "I can't walk this pathless mountain slope." "Ah, of course," he replied. The man easily lifted her onto his back. The man remembered the day he first gained the woman. On that day, he had also carried her on his back as they climbed the mountain path on the other side of the pass. That day had been full of happiness, but today's happiness felt even richer. "Do you remember the first time I met you? You carried me then too," the woman said, recalling the past. "I was just thinking about that too," he replied. The man smiled happily. "Look, you can see it now. That's all my mountain. The valleys, the trees, the birds, even the clouds, it's all my mountain. The mountain is so wonderful, isn't it? Makes you want to run, doesn't it? That never happened in the capital," he said, his voice filled with joy. "On the first day, you carried me and made me run," the woman recalled. "That's right, I was so tired, my head was spinning," he laughed. The man hadn't forgotten the peak bloom of the cherry blossom forest. However, on this happy day, What could the sight of that forest in full bloom really mean? He was not afraid. And then, the cherry blossom forest appeared before him, in full bloom. The petals, blown by the wind, fluttered and fell. The ground was covered with a blanket of petals. Where had these petals fallen from? It seemed impossible that a single petal could have fallen, considering the clusters of flowers in full bloom spreading overhead, as far as the eye could see. The man walked deeper into the sea of blossoms beneath the full bloom of the flowers. The surroundings seemed to grow eerily still, and gradually, a coldness began to settle. The man suddenly noticed that the woman's hand had become cold. An unexpected feeling of unease washed over him. In an instant, he realized, she was a demon. A sudden chilling wind swept through the area, coming from all directions beneath the flowers. Clinging to his back was a large, elderly woman with a face that was entirely purple. Her mouth stretched from ear to ear, and her shriveled hair was green. The man ran. He tried to shake her off. The demon's hand tightened around his throat, and his vision began to fade. He was in a frenzy. With all his strength, he managed to loosen the demon's grip. Pulling his neck free from the hand, he slid down his back, and with a thud, the demon fell. Now it was his turn to overpower the demon. He strangled its neck, and when he suddenly realized what he was doing, he had already used all his strength to choke the woman's neck, and the woman was already lifeless. His vision blurred. He tried to open his eyes wider, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his vision hadn't returned. This was because the woman he had strangled was, as before, still lying there, the same woman, her lifeless body present before him. His breath stopped. His strength, his thoughts, all came to a halt at once. A few cherry blossom petals had already fallen onto the woman's body. He shook her, calling her name. But nothing happened. It was in vain. Overcome with despair, he burst into tears. Perhaps, since he had settled in this mountain until this day, he had never cried, and when he naturally returned to himself, he realized that white petals had gathered on his back. He was right in the middle of the cherry blossom forest. The edges of the forest were hidden by the flowers, and the depths could not be seen. The usual fears and anxieties were gone. There was no cold wind blowing from the edge of the flowers. It was only quietly, and softly, that the petals continued to fall. He was sitting for the first time beneath the full bloom of the cherry blossom forest. He could stay there forever, for he had no place left to return to. The secret of the full bloom beneath the cherry blossom trees remains unknown to anyone, even now. Perhaps it was solitude. This is because the man no longer needed to fear loneliness. He himself had become solitude itself. For the first time, he looked around him. Above, there were flowers. Beneath them, quietly, the infinite void was filled. The flowers fell softly, that was all. There were no secrets outside of this. After some time, he began to feel a single warm sensation. He realized that it was the sadness in his own chest. Surrounded by the crisp coldness of the flowers and the void, the faint warmth of the swelling sorrow slowly began to take shape. He tried to remove the petals from the woman's face. As his hand reached toward her face, it seemed as though something strange had happened. Under his hand, only the fallen petals remained, and the woman's form had vanished, leaving behind only a few petals. When he tried to brush the petals away, both his hand and his body disappeared as well. What remained was only the petals and the cold, stretched out void.
Until we meet again, may the stories of Japan inspire your days. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales.